Every story has a hero, the one who saves people, the one who does the right thing, but the one we're told to root for. But what if the story got it wrong? What if the real hero was never the one pretending to be one? Because Damon Salvatore was never the good brother. He didn't follow the rules, he didn't chase redemption, and he definitely didn't care about being liked. He was selfish, violent, unpredictable, and yet when it mattered the most, he was always the one who made the choice no one else could. Not because it was right, not because it was necessary. So maybe the question isn't why Damon was so bad. Maybe the real question is, why does a character who admits he's a monster end up acting more human than everyone else? Damon Salvatore is not a hero in the traditional sense. He doesn't walk into a room and try and do the right thing. He doesn't ask what's morally correct. And he definitely doesn't wait for approval before making decisions. Damon always puts himself first. At least, that's what it looks like on the surface. Because if you only judge him by his intentions, he fails instantly. He's impulsive. He's selfish. He prioritizes what he wants in the moment over what anyone else thinks is right. But here's where it gets complicated. Damon doesn't operate on rules, he operates on people. And the closer someone gets to him, the more that changes. Because the truth is, Damon Salvatore cares deeply, not in a clean, heroic way, but in a possessive, emotional, almost destructive way. When he loves someone, he doesn't just want them safe, he wants them alive, present, and with him, even if that means making choices they would never agree with. But that's where his morality gets blurred, because Damon will absolutely do the wrong thing for what he believes is the right income. He doesn't ask Elena what she wants. He asks what will keep her safe, even if she hates him for it. He doesn't always respect Stefan Salvatore's moral code, because in his eyes, morality is fragile, survival isn't, and when his friends are in danger, Damon becomes something else entirely. He doesn't hesitate, he doesn't negotiate, he acts, sometimes brutally, sometimes recklessly, but always with the best intentions. And this is a contradiction at the core of Damon Salvatore. He puts himself first until he cares about someone who is involved. Then suddenly he stops acting like a man who only thinks about himself and starts acting like someone willing to burn everything down just to protect the people he loves. But here's the important part. He doesn't do it for praise. He doesn't do it to be seen as good. He doesn't even do it to be forgiven. In fact, most of the time, he knows he'll be hated for it, and he always does it anyway, because Damon's version of love isn't permission-based, it's not gentle, it's not clean, it's not decisive. If you believe something will hurt you, he removes it, even if you never ask him to, even if you never wanted him to. That's what makes him dangerous, and also what makes him consistent. Because unlike Stefan Salvatore, who's completely battles between identity and impulse, Damon is honest about what he is. He doesn't pretend his actions are pure, he just owns them. And that's the uncomfortable truth underneath it all. Damon Salvatore doesn't try to be good, but when it comes to the people he cares about, he chooses them every time, even if it costs him everything else. There's a version of Damon Salvatore people like to defend. The misunderstood brother, the broken man, the one who just needed love. But that version doesn't survive contact with what he actually did. Because if you strip away the romance, if you remove the music, if you ignore the framing of the story, what you're left with is something a lot more disturbing. You're left with a man who has hurt people on purpose, repeatedly, and often without hesitation, not because he was forced, not because he lost control, but because at the time he wanted to. There's a version of Damon that walks through history like a slow-moving storm, and wherever he goes, consequence follows. He doesn't just kill enemies, he chooses targets, people who trust him, people who underestimate him, people who simply happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when he decides the rules don't apply anymore. And the most unsettling part, he often doesn't look angry when he does it. He looks calm, like it's routine, like it's just what happens when the world doesn't behave the way he thinks it should. One of the early things you learn about Damon Salvatore is that he doesn't value restraint. If there's a line, he will test it. If there's a boundary, he will cross it. If someone tells him no, that word rarely survives a conversation. Over time, this becomes less of a trait and more of a pattern, compulsion, manipulation, violence, used not just as defense, but as communication. People around him aren't people. They become tools in a system he controls. And when the tools stop working, they are discarded. There's something almost ritualistic about the way Damon breaks things, not just physically, but emotionally. Trust doesn't just fade around him, it collapses. He enters relationships like he owns the outcome already, and when reality pushes back, he doesn't adjust, he forces it. And then there's a memory of what he does when he feels rejected, not just ignored, but unwanted. That's when Damon becomes the most unpredictable, because rejection doesn't make him retreat, it makes him escalate. He doesn't process pain inwards, he redirects it outwards into the world, into people who had nothing to do with it. And in those moments, he stops feeling like a character in a drama and starts feeling like something closer to a warning, a reminder of what happens when emotion has no restraint attached to it. And what makes it even more complicated is that Damon doesn't live in denial. He knows what he's capable of. He remembers what he has done. And instead of stopping him, that awareness just sits around him like a background noise. Not guilt that prevents repetition, but the memory that normalizes it. That's what makes him dangerous in a different kind of way. Not just random chaos, but consistent chaos with intention behind it. And in the world he moves through, people don't just get hurt physically, they get changed. Friends become cautious around him. Allies learn to forgive things they shouldn't never have to do in the first place. And enemies often don't even get the dignity of understanding why they were chosen in the first place. Because Damon Salvatore doesn't always justify himself. He acts first, explains later, and sometimes there is no explanation, only aftermath, only silence after the storm has passed, only the question left hanging in the air. How much of this was necessary? How much of it was just him? And the question doesn't have an easy answer, because the same man who destroys lives without hesitation is also the man who remembers every one of them. If Damon Salvatore was only the things he did when he was angry, there will be no debate left to have. But the story doesn't let him stay in that place, because buried under everything destructive about him, there's something else that keeps breaking through. Not goodness in the traditional sense, but sacrifice. It doesn't always look very noble when he does it. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like disappearance. And sometimes it looks like Damon becoming something even he doesn't recognize. There's a moment that defines this best most of all, when Damon turns off his humanity, not as a metaphor, but literally. He shuts it down. And what comes after that isn't peace, it's emptiness. Because for Damon Salvatore, emotions aren't just feelings, they're anchors. And when he removes them, he doesn't become free, he becomes directionless. That period in his life shows something important. Damon without emotions isn't stronger, he's just disconnected from the only thing that ever made his actions meaningful. And yet, even in that state, he ends up still tied back to the people he cares about, because that's the contradiction of him. Even when he tries to run from connections, it keeps pulling him back. And no relationship defines that more than Stefan Salvatore. Their bond is not clean, it never is. They fight, they betray each other, they destroy each other's lives more than once. But underneath all of it, there is something Damon never fully lets go of, and that's responsibility. Even when he resents Stefan, even when he feels overshadowed, even when he has every excuse to walk away permanently, he doesn't. And when Stefan is in danger, Damon doesn't calculate morality, he moves. Time and time again, Damon puts himself directly in situations where survival is not guaranteed, not because he thinks he's invincible, but because the alternative, doing nothing, is worse than him taking the risk. And then there's Elena Gilbert. For Damon, loving her is not just emotional, it becomes behavioral. He doesn't love her from a distance. He places himself in danger repeatedly to keep her alive, not in dramatic speeches, but in decisions made quickly, often without telling anyone, where he takes a hit so someone else doesn't have to. And that pattern becomes one of the clearest contradictions in him. A man who claims selfishness, constantly choosing self-sacrifice when it actually matters. But maybe the most overlooked part of Damon isn't violence or the chaos, it's his friendships he forms when he isn't trying anything other than what he is. Bonnie Bennett is one of the clearest examples of this. A relationship that starts with conflict, distrust, and damage between them slowly shifts into something built on mutual reliance, not romantic, not manipulative, something closer to understanding. Over time, Damon and Bonnie begin to operate like two people who simply trust each other to show up when it matters. And for Damon, that kind of relationship is rare because it requires consistency, it requires accountability, and somehow he manages to give it, even when he doesn't ask for anything in return. Then there are the quieter moments, the ones the story doesn't always highlight loudly, like when Damon comforts Rose as she is dying, not with grand speeches or false hope, but with something gentler. He gives her a dream, a constructed memory of peace, a final moment where fear doesn't exist. For someone like Damon, who is often associated with destruction, that moment is almost unrecognizable because it isn't about control, it isn't about power, it's about easing suffering. And when there are the sacrifices that never fully get acknowledged in real time, the choices Damon makes where no one is watching, where there is no reward waiting for him, no recognition, no guarantee that anyone will ever know what he did, and yet he still does them. Not because he believes he will be forgiven, but because somebody has to. This is the part of Damon Salvatore that complicates everything, because if he was purely selfish, the pattern wouldn't break, but it does. Again and again. He does what he wants. He endures pain he doesn't need to endure. He steps into danger without hesitation when somebody else is at the center of it. And the most important detail in this, he rarely tells anyone. Because for Damon, sacrifice isn't something he performs for identity. It's something he does because in the moment it feels unavoidable. And what does that say about him? He doesn't erase what he's done. He doesn't rewrite his past. But it does make something very clear. Damon Salvatore is not consistent in his morality, but he is consistent in one thing. When it matters the most, he chooses people over himself, even when he has no reason to, even when it costs him everything, and sometimes even when it costs him who he is. Do you see how well I pronounced all them words, bro? Come on. Let's break the fourth wall for a second. The way I make these videos is I write a script, I break it into sections of each chapter of the story, and then I do visuals for each one. I did fail English in school, so I apologize if I mumble some of my words. It's a skill I'm practicing. While you're here listening, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. It really does help push the algorithm, and if you want to see more Vampire Diaries breakdowns, we need to push these videos. Let's get into the next chapter. The illusion of the good brother. Stefan Salvatore is often framed as a better man, the moral one, the controlled one, the brother who chooses restraint over chaos. And on the surface, that framing makes sense because Stefan tries. He tries to be good in a way Damon rarely even attempts. He follows rules, he sets boundaries, he carries guilt like it's part of his identity. But underneath that image, there's a problem that never fully goes away. Stefan's bloodlust, and he doesn't disappear. He doesn't resolve. He doesn't get conquered in any final clean way. It gets managed, suppressed, delayed, hidden behind structure and discipline, but never truly eliminated. And that's important because Stefan's goodness is not the absence of darkness, it's a constant effort to contain it. There are moments where that control slips, and when it does, the difference between Stefan and Damon feels less absolute than people assume. Because Stefan, when he loses control, doesn't become someone else. He becomes what he has always been trying not to be, and that raises a difficult question. If your morality depends entirely on constant restraint, what happens when the restraint fails? Stefan's identity is built around recovery, around apology, around the idea as long as he keeps choosing to fight himself, he remains a good brother. But fighting yourself is not the same as being free of yourself. Remember that. It's just ongoing conflict. And the show never really resolves that tension. Instead, it positions Stefan as a moral baseline, the one Damon is compared against, the standard of better. But when you look closer, Stefan's goodness often exists in opposition to something he is actively suppressing rather than something he has fully overcome. and that changes how his choices read, because restraint without resolution is fragile, and fragility is not the same as purity. Meanwhile, Damon does not build his identity around pretending that darkness isn't there. He acknowledges it, he acts through it, he often lets it define him. And here's a thing where the contrast becomes uncomfortable. Stefan's control sometimes creates distance between him and the people he claims to protect, because control is not always connection. Sometimes it's isolation, a constant internal battle that makes emotional presence harder, not easier. And that matters when you're trying to decide what good actually means in a world like this. Because if goodness is defined as control over yourself, Stefan wins. But if goodness is defined as what you choose when control is tested, the answer becomes less stable. And that's where the illusion begins to crack. Because a good brother is not someone without darkness. He's someone constantly negotiating with it, just like Damon, and just in a different direction. And once you see that, the contrast between them stops being clean. It stops being hero versus villain, and starts becoming two different ways of living within the same problem. One hides it, one lives with it, but neither really escapes it. Boom.
After everything, the labels start to fall apart. Hero, villain, good brother, bad brother. They stop meaning as much as they are supposed to. Because when you strip away the arguments, the justifications, the moments taken out of context, what you're left with is something simpler. Two men shaped by the same curse. Two men reacting differently to the same damage. Two men constantly failing in different directions. And somewhere in the middle of that, the idea of a hero starts to feel less like a truth, and more like a role the story hands out when it needs one. Damon Salvatore was never clean. He was never stable. He was never predictable. And he was never trying to be what people expected him to be. But when you trace his actions across the story, something uncomfortable starts to appear. Not consistency in morality, but consistency in choice. When it mattered most, he acted. Sometimes selfishly. Sometimes violently. Sometimes in ways that are impossible to defend on paper. But also, sometimes in ways that no one else was willing to. He stepped into danger when it cost him everything. He protected people who didn't always forgive him for it. He made decisions others couldn't make, even when they hated him for them afterward. And maybe that's where the real question sits. Not whether Damon was good, but whether good was ever the right measurement in the first place. Because Stefan Salvatore represents control, restraint, the idea that morality is something you maintain. But Damon represents something messier. The idea that morality is something you prove in the moment you decide to act. Neither one escapes what they are. Both of them fail. Both of them hurt people. Both of them save people. The difference is just in how they explain it afterward. And when you look at it like that, the entire idea of the real hero starts to dissolve. Because maybe the story was never about one brother being better than the other. Maybe it was about what happens when survival, love, guilt, and identity all collide in the same place, and there is no clean version of any choice left. So when people ask who the hero was, maybe the answer isn't a name. Maybe it's a pattern. A pattern of people doing what they believe is necessary, and living with what comes after. And Damon Salvatore fits into that pattern in a way that's impossible to ignore. Not because he was right. Not because he was wrong. But because he never stopped choosing. Even when it cost him everything. And maybe, in a story where everyone is broken in different ways, the real illusion was believing there was ever supposed to be just one hero at all.